Has it ever struck you odd that Jesus is always referred to as
Jesus of Nazareth?
This Jesus of Nazareth.
What then to do about Jesus of Nazareth?
It's odd when the Jewish expectation was that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem.
We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the book of the law, and whom the prophets also wrote about. He is Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth.
Can anything good come from Nazareth?
Stay tuned and let the Bible Skeptic demonstrate for you yet another failed apologetic. This time, Jesus, the Nazarene Prophecy. The Bible Skeptic provides YouTube's best resource for countering Christian apologetics. These aren't just knee-jerk opinions, but seriously researched answers that you can use as solid foundations for informed skepticism. If you like what you find, please subscribe, comment below, drop an idea for a topic you'd like to see covered, and don't forget to consider supporting this channel through Patreon. Your support will assure more videos like these will continue to be produced. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, gives 4 prophecies, all having to do with Jesus' movement, from his birth in Bethlehem to his journey in and out of Egypt, and finally to his home in Nazareth. A primary purpose of Matthew's infancy narrative was to preempt Jewish objections to Jesus' origins. According to Matthew, Jesus had a legitimate Davidic pedigree through his legal father Joseph, and he had fulfilled the Jewish expectation of the Messiah as coming from Bethlehem, because his prophecy fulfillment was baked into his gospel narrative. However, everyone in the New Testament knows Jesus as an individual from Nazareth.
Nazareth, the famous son.
How does one explain then this apparent contradiction? The birth narratives of Matthew and Luke differ on how and why Jesus is born in Bethlehem, while the Gospel of Mark simply glosses over Jesus' origins and begins with Jesus' baptism, and John's tale starts by placing Jesus at the very beginning of time. While Luke has Jesus' parents temporarily relocate from their hometown of Nazareth to Bethlehem just in time for Jesus' birth, Matthew has the family already living in Bethlehem. It isn't until later in Matthew's story that we hear about Nazareth, and then that's the way it is for the rest of both Matthew's and Luke's Gospels, and everywhere else in the New Testament. Nowhere else is there again any mention of Bethlehem in the Jesus saga. In fact, outside the 2 Gospel birth narratives, Jesus is exclusively associated with the town of Nazareth. The identification is even nailed to the cross with him. The only association of Jesus with Bethlehem is in the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke. So, was there any sort of prophecy about the Messiah and Nazareth? Surely, if Jesus was so closely associated with the little village in Galilee, the ancient prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures would have just as carefully pinpointed its significance in the life of the all-important Jewish Messiah, at least as much as they did about his birth in Bethlehem, especially if the Messiah was only to spend at most only his first 2 years in Bethlehem, and the remaining 3 decades or so in Nazareth.
I mean, you'd think so?
Apparently, the author of Matthew's Gospel thought so, and referenced just such a prophecy in his birth narrative. Recall, in chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, he specifies Jesus' fulfillment of certain Old Testament prophecies. The first is about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. Matthew quotes from the prophet Micah, underscoring Jesus' birth in the small village, noting, "Out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Matthew's next prophecy follows Herod's fear of the child Jesus and his plans to have the infant killed.
Ready,
Kill.
the baby!
Kill.
The baby.
Kill.
The baby.
In a dream, Joseph was warned to take his family from their hometown of Bethlehem and flee to Egypt. Matthew notes, "And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" The so-called prophecy here is found in Hosea 11:1. Now that Jesus is quoted clearly from two prophetic books from the Hebrew Scriptures regarding Jesus' birth in Bethlehem and then his move into Egypt, Matthew then directly quotes from a prophecy in the book of Jeremiah. Matthew uses verse 15 from chapter 31 from the prophet's book to explain why Herod killed the infants of Bethlehem. It was all part of God's plan. Now that Matthew has the infant Jesus born in Bethlehem and escaped to Egypt, all to fulfill specific prophecies in the ancient Hebrew texts, how is he going to get the Holy Family into Nazareth? Obviously, if the family were to return home, they would simply return to their village of Bethlehem, from which they left. But as noted, everyone in the New Testament knows Jesus is from Nazareth. He is consistently, even today, referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem.
His name's Jesus. He's from Nazareth.
No one suspects he originated in Bethlehem. So what does Matthew do? What prophecy can he quote from that will calm the controversy? He makes one up. Matthew notes that after another angelic visit while in Egypt, given the message that all was clear back home following Herod's death, Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Trouble is, there is nothing in the prophets stating that anyone, much less the future Jewish Messiah, would be called a Nazarene. In fact, the village of Nazareth isn't mentioned in the ancient scriptures at all. And the author of Matthew knew it. We know he knows his prophecy is an invention because he presents this so-called fulfillment differently than he had the previous three. He doesn't introduce the Nazarene prophecy with a quotation, and he ascribes the saying generically to the prophets rather than to the prophet, as he did prior. The author of Matthew made up this prophecy out of thin air to account for the universal understanding and fact that everyone knew Jesus was from Nazareth, and there was no messianic expectation that Israel's Savior would come from that tiny backwater village. So Matthew invented one. Biblical apologists over the years have concocted explanations for this so-called prophecy in a vain effort to remove the stink of its absurdity and ill fit within the larger context of Matthew's gospel. Again, when Matthew has a prophecy to fulfill, he refers to it in his text. That is why the Nazarene prophecy stands out like a sore thumb.
Nothing, you stick out like a sore thumb around here.
Some apologists argue that Matthew's meaning of he would be called a Nazarene is an echo of Judges 16:17, where the biblical hero Samson declares himself to be God's Nazarite. A Nazarite, or as in the Hebrew Nazir, was a kind of holy man, and it was in this sense that Matthew intended his phrase. But a Nazarite, in the sense of one committed to God in the manner of someone like Samson, has nothing to do with the town of Nazareth. One needn't be a Nazarene to be a Nazarite, so this apologetic falls completely flat. Other apologists note that Nazareth had a reputation in the New Testament as a backwater town, looked down upon by others. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Nathanael, one of Jesus' earliest disciples, quips in John 1:46 after he is told by his friend Philip about the amazing miracle man. John's Gospel also notes that some Jews argued that Jesus could not have been the Messiah precisely because he was from Galilee, where Nazareth was located.
The Messiah will not come from Galilee!
The scripture says that the Messiah will be a descendant of King David and will be born in Bethlehem, the town where David lived.
While others specifically said to search the Hebrew scriptures to learn that a Nazarene couldn't be the Messiah.
Study the scriptures, and you will learn that no prophet ever comes from Galilee.
This identification of Nazareth with a lowly status fulfills for these apologists the so-called suffering servant prophecy of Isaiah 53, in which this person would be despised by others. And who was more despised in Jesus' time than someone from Nazareth, if we're to believe the characterizations in John? I already have a video on the suffering servant and this notion of being despised, so more details on this specific prophecy can be found there. Suffice to say that Isaiah 53 is not a messianic prophecy, and certainly has nothing to do with a future Galilean named Jesus. Besides, again, if Matthew had intended his Nazarene prophecy to be a reference to Isaiah 53, he would have stated so and quoted from the text, just as he did for the previous 3 prophecies. Nowhere outside the New Testament is there any evidence that Nazareth was considered a backwater village that was looked down upon by the larger populace. But the comments in John certainly underscore the reason why Matthew and Luke both made strained efforts to assure readers Jesus had been born in Bethlehem, satisfying Jewish expectations for the Messiah. An apologetic tactic apparently missed by the author of John. Finally, many apologists have adopted the argument that the Hebrew word Netzer, meaning branch, is what Matthew meant by his enigmatic prophecy. Nazareth and Netzer share a common Hebrew root, and so this apologetic claims the author of Matthew was simply making a play on words. But writing in Koine Greek, Hebrew wordplay really wouldn't have worked in Matthew's gospel. Nonetheless, as the apologetic argument goes, the Hebrew word Netzer occurs in an Isaiah prophecy about the future Davidic Messiah. A shoot will grow from the stump of Jesse, and a branch will spring from its roots. If Matthew had meant for his Nazarene prophecy to have been a fulfillment of Isaiah 11:1, even if it were so-called Hebrew wordplay, why did he not simply follow his prior pattern of quoting from the scriptures? How does one know Matthew intended to make a play on words? He hadn't done so earlier.
Duh.
Matthew had been very specific with his prophecy quoting, until now. Why the sudden switch? In fact, 12 times in his gospel, Matthew interrupts the story to tell us that the event he is narrating fulfilled a specific prophecy, which he then quotes. The only reason to propose a wordplay suddenly in this part of his narrative is to create an apologetic to rescue Matthew from making an error and asserting he will be called a Nazarene was a fulfillment of prophecy. Besides, where is the evidence that Nazareth was understood to mean branch? The entire apologetic rests upon this supposed wordplay, but Nazareth doesn't mean something like city of the branch. The root word is nasar, and itself means to guard or to watch over. So it's just as likely Nazareth means watch city or guardian city as it might mean branch city. This is the thinnest of apologetics in an attempt to rescue Matthew's prophecy. It's more likely the author of Matthew's gospel was hoping no one would fact check him and be like this guy from a church in Colorado, reading the verse and simply assuming he was correct.
Wow, no, that's quite an explanation. I mean, I just read the verse and just accepted it as a prophecy that, as with all the other prophecies, but that is very, very interesting, and for that explanation.
But did you notice anything about these apologetic explanations for Matthew's so-called prophecy regarding Jesus' identification with Nazareth? They're exclusive in and of themselves. If Matthew was referring to Jesus being a Nazarite holy man, as in Judges 16, then he wasn't referring to Jesus coming from the town of Branch, as in Isaiah 11, and vice versa. If Matthew meant that Jesus was supposed to be identified as coming from a despised town, just as Jesus himself is a despised person, as described in Isaiah 53, then Matthew didn't have Judges 16 or Isaiah 11 in mind. Unless one wants to argue that Matthew indeed had all these disparate, unrelated verses in mind and wanted to lump them all together in a confusing final prophecy of chapter 2. but that's highly doubtful, based upon his otherwise careful use of prophecy quoting throughout the rest of his gospel. In addition, not a single drop of apologetic ink has been spilled trying to explain what Matthew meant by his other references to prophecies in his infancy narrative. The prior three are all easily located in the prophetic literature. Only the Nazarene Prophecy has Christian apologists tying themselves into pretzels. Did you enjoy this video? Hit that like button, subscribe, and click for notifications. Leave a comment, and don't forget to check out the rest of the videos on this channel. There's a lot of content to help you deal with Christian apologetics, so kick your shoes off and stay a while.